Welcome everyone to this session, the second session of the ConneXions webinar series. ConneXions is a webinar series that we started last year with the aim of helping people understand the interdisciplinarity in multiple disciplines that are there across the world. Also something that education must have now with the sort of unpredictable times that we are in. For our second session today, we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic. I think for times immemorable, we've always learned and heard and always retained fantastic stories, whether they were stories told to us by our parents or by our grandparents, whether you're sitting with your friends after maybe a gap of a decade, you're still reliving stories from times that you've spent together. So stories have a very strong way of being there in your memory, and communicating through stories can also be as effective. We are going to be talking about this topic on storytelling and how can you use this for stronger communication in today's session. For this, I have with me, it's my pleasure to host Professor Michael Burns for this very, very important session where we are going to be talking about why storytelling is important in messaging, how can you use it more effective, how can you change core ideas into making things much more interesting for you as well. Professor Michael completed his PhD in documentary film history from the University of Birmingham in the UK in 2008. He's also the first student in the UK to submit an audio-visual doctorate. He's since then completed 5 documentary films of international work, and his work has appeared in over 20 countries. In recent years, he's developed an interest in story structure and traditions of storytelling. He teaches popular creative writing workshops. He's published 3 books derived from his storytelling work. And in addition to his work as a writing coach for aspiring writers, he also runs international writing retreats through his company, The Story Retreat. Michael, I'm so glad that I'm sharing the stage, and I don't think we could have asked for a better person to talk about storytelling than you. And I'm not going to keep everyone waiting for a longer time. So let me just quickly run you guys through a little bit tidbit on what the controls are. You have the Q&A box in front of your screens. Please use the Q&A box to put in any questions at any point of the presentation. If you wish to ask a question to Michael at that point of time, it'll be easier for me to bring it to him while he's dealing with that particular topic. The chat box is also open, so we'll keep it live in case if Michael has any questions for you, you can probably chip in with your answers on the chat box as well. With that, I open the session, and Michael, all yours.
So I'm going to tell you some things that I think you've probably heard before, but my talk wouldn't be of any value unless I tell you some things that are going to be new. So I hope that some of what I say unsettles you a little bit and makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, because that means that we're actually learning something. Okay. So my specialty, my academic focus is storytelling, and it's something that I became interested in about 25 years ago, and I'm still learning quite a bit about this field. But maybe because of the work that I do in reading clients' work, I'm a story coach in addition to my teaching at Flame, and I help people write novels and textbooks and articles and screenplays and all kinds of things like that. And I've gathered some insights about stories that I think might be useful for us. So the first thing that I want you to think about is a question that we should start every discussion with, no matter what the topic might be, which is, what is a story? Now, you might be saying to yourself, I know what this is. I don't need to start with that, but I'm not sure that most people do. It's a question that I'm really interested in, because it has a lot, these days, there's a lot of different answers, and I'll tell you why there are so many different answers. So this is kind of like almost like a story type of workshop or a story seminar, and I like to go to these things too. Even though I've delivered hundreds of story discussions and workshops and seminars and classes, I like to go every once in a while. There's always more to learn from me. And also, like, sometimes when a presenter is doing something, I like to look at the way that they talk about something and see if I can glean something from that. And about 5 years ago, I was at a literature festival, and I was sitting in the audience, and it was a workshop on storytelling, and the facilitator was talking about stories, this and that, and I was kind of zoning out. Most of it was material I had thought about quite a bit before, and I really wasn't paying close attention. And all of a sudden, about 10 minutes into the workshop, a young man, maybe about 15 or 16 in front of me, he raised his hand. And he said, and she called on him and he said, before we go any further, can I just ask a really stupid question? Like, I know, like, I feel so dumb because everybody just kind of skipped past this at the beginning and I'm feeling lost. And he apologized for himself, and he said, could you just tell me what a story actually is? So suddenly I became very interested because I think that this question is the most fundamental question. You can't skip past this question. And I knew that we were in trouble in the workshop when the facilitator said, well, that's very easy to answer. A story is anything with a beginning, middle, and end, she said. And I kind of said, uh-oh, we're in for a long workshop. That's part of it, but it's not enough. I mean, breakfast has a beginning, middle, and end. A football match has a beginning, middle, and end. Lots of things. A tornado, a typhoon has a beginning, middle, and end. A lot of things have a beginning, middle, and end. Doesn't mean that they're stories. So this question to me is very fundamental of what is a story. And it's a very problematic question to answer in the 21st century. And here's why. That the word story is not even really used as a normal word these days. It's more like an umbrella term that covers all kinds of things. So think about it this way. Some people are writing stories that are this thick, like short stories. George R.R. Martin and other authors, they're writing stories that are this thick. On television, we see newspaper reporters filing stories, right? We see broadcasters delivering stories. Some people are saying in 140 characters on your phone, you can write a story. And now Instagram and Facebook are telling us that a photograph of our breakfast, right, is a story. It's getting to the point where the word story has essentially become to mean anything that I find interesting. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. And you hear these very nice sounding things. Sometimes people say, every moment is a story, everything is a story. That sounds very, very nice. But if this is your definition, and it comes time for you to do something like what we're talking about today, which is how to use storytelling in your communication, how to build stories, how to integrate them into your overall strategy. And you're using as an operative definition, a story is anything I find interesting. That's not a very useful blueprint. Suddenly, that pop culture definition shows its limits. Okay, if everything is a story, then it's very hard for us to actually build one. Okay, so we can do better than that. In fact, there's only one word in the English language that I think has been more overused and mangled and stretched out of proportion than the word story, and that would be the word democracy. I think pretty much most of us, I think we use the word democracy to refer to any organization or country or something that has voting. In other words, if there's voting, then we call that a democracy. But it takes about 3 seconds to realize how empty that definition is, because think about it, if you don't have things like human rights, gender equality, workers' rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, all these things, if you don't have these prerequisites to democracy, then voting doesn't matter at all, obviously, because we know this because North Korea has voting, right? So just because somebody has voting doesn't mean that they're a democracy, but yet we use that label to cover anything that has voting. Same thing with story. Anything we find interesting, we're going to call it a story. But if we want to use stories strategically and figure out what they really are, we have to know how they're built. And these types of pop culture definitions become very, very useless. So over the course of the talk today, I'm going to give you 4, possibly 5, maybe even an extra definition of what a story is. That's not only going to be different than the pop culture definitions, but it's going to be useful for you, because in that definition that I'm going to be giving you, it's going to give you hints about how to build a story. It's not just a definition that's going to make you feel good. It's a definition that's actually going to help you to streamline your communication and use storytelling to do it. So let's get into the first definition. And the first one is really important because we have to go way back in time to talk about how stories ended up coming about in the first place. So when I talk to my students at Flame or in my workshops with other writers, I always like to tell them that, storytelling is in your DNA. And when you hear somebody say this, like, storytelling is in your DNA, it's kind of like a fancy way of saying that somebody is good at something, like, painting is in Dali's DNA, tennis is in Steffi Graf's DNA. It's just like a cricket is in Tendulkar's DNA. It's just like a turn of phrase, right? The meaning that so-and-so is good at it. I don't mean it like that. I mean that storytelling is literally buried in the alleles of your genetic code. And the question becomes why? Now, I'm not the only one who believes this. There are many, many people who believe this. And the question becomes why? How? Why? Is it true? And the clue here is that why is anything in any creature's DNA, after all these millions of years, possibly billions of years of evolution, going all the way back from bacteria up until what we have now, why is our genetic code the way it is? Why have certain things survived and certain things haven't up until now? And that key word is survive. The reason that something is in our DNA is because in some way it added to the likelihood of our survival as a species. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in our DNA. So the reason that our DNA is the way it is because every little piece somehow gives us some little advantage. So that begs the question, which is, what the heck does storytelling have to do with our survival? And it has to do with the fact that information is notoriously forgettable. So hopefully this talk is not going to be forgettable, but most things that you hear on a daily basis go in one ear and out the other. Information, notoriously forgettable. Very difficult to retain lots of information. And if we go back 50,000 years ago to the African savanna, somewhere between Eritrea and Ethiopia today, we go back to our first ancestors and we think about their lives. So they shared a lot of information. They communicated regularly, just like so many other of the people we share the planet with and the creatures we share the planet with. They communicated all the time. But they didn't have one thing that we have right now that we take for granted. One incredibly important aspect of communication that we use all the time, and that's writing. As far as we know, they did not have writing, maybe some cave paintings and things like that, but still a system of archival writing is not something they had. Why is that such a big deal? Because when we have a particular insight, something really important that we want to preserve, we will write it down, and it has a lifespan beyond just ourselves. They didn't have that. So when they had information that was really important, not the type of information that goes in one ear and out the other, but the type of information that they really wanted to make sure that somebody else would not only hear, but remember, they had a problem. And the problem is, I have important insights to share, insights about, let's say, where to find water, where to find food, how to build shelter, where to avoid predators, right? All of these things. They had these various incredibly important insights in their lives, and they had to share them with others in a way that wouldn't be forgotten. And so what our ancestors did to solve this problem is they developed a technology. What is technology? Essentially a design tool that solves a problem. They developed a technology that allowed them to take information, plain old forgettable information, and put it together in a certain pattern so that it would become unforgettable. So again, this is our first definition of what a story is. A story is information that has been put together in a certain way to make it unforgettable. Story. Our ancestors invented a story to solve their problem of notoriously forgettable information. And this brings us back to the very first myths, some of which have even survived all the way to this day. Allowing them to share insights, not just with the people around them so that they wouldn't be forgotten, but so that they would never be forgotten generation to generation to generation. A pattern that leads to memorability. Okay, so this is really important to remember that stories are not like other modes of communication. They're particularly memorable because of their shape. And it leads to another question, which is, okay, that's nice, but what is that shape? Okay, like, I agree with you. They had to make this thing and they had to put it in a shape, but what's that shape look like? And that's going to be the majority of what we talk about today. What is that shape? What are the contours and the details of that technology that they built? How did they put this together? How do you take information and make it unforgettable? There's something else that we have to talk about first. When you're trying to define something, when you're trying to understand like what a story is and why are we doing this? Because once you know what a story is, you know that then you know how you can shape it and build it into something that can aid in your communication, whatever that might be. You have to know one other thing before we do that. Andrew, do you want to ask any questions?
No, go ahead. Okay.
So what I was going to say is, when you're trying to define something, sometimes it's really useful to find out what that thing is not. Do you remember Venn diagrams from some science class with these overlapping circles? Like when you eliminate something, whatever's remaining, that must be what your thing is. And this it's really important here because there's probably a term that you've heard of before called anecdote. An anecdote. And the question is, okay, what is an anecdote? Is it the same thing as a story and all this stuff? An anecdote is a description of an event that usually has a moral, ironic, or humorous ending to it, okay? Fine, very nice. So what's the big deal? The big deal is that a story is a depiction of multiple events. Now you might be saying, well, obviously stories are much longer than anecdotes, correct. But that seemingly small difference gives birth to the entire field of storytelling right there. Well, why is that such a big deal? Single events and multiple events. So when I describe this to my students, I feel really old because, I remember when I went on vacation when I was younger, you would print out your photographs. You would bring your film reel to a shop and they would print out your pictures for you. And it's kind of useful to think about that when we talk about an anecdote versus a photo versus a story. When you're holding up one single photo in your hand, okay, it's kind of like an anecdote. It's like a frozen moment in time. I can describe this single event if I want to. It's all located right here in this picture. But if I hold up two photos, let's say two photos of the same thing, there is something now that I can detect that I couldn't detect when I had just one. I want you to think about this for a few seconds. There is a level of perception that is now available to you when you have two photos. To give you a little bit of a hint, imagine taking a picture of an amphitheater, where ancient people would go and look at a play or a concert or something like that. Imagine taking a photo of it empty and another photo of it full. What can you see? What is suddenly possible to notice? And the answer obviously is change. With two photos, you can see the process of change from one state to another state. And that idea of change is fundamental to what a story is. If there is no change, there is no story. So when we're moving to define what a story is, we have to keep that in mind. It's almost like the river that runs under every story. Change must be shot through it, or else we're still in the level of anecdote and description. And just before we take some questions, I'll give you a final comment on this idea of change. There's basically three types of change that must appear in any story. Now, when I say must appear, as long as one of these is present, we have left anecdotes and we move to story. Most stories that you can think of probably have all three, but as long as one of them is there, we're okay. The first one is change in circumstance. Something in the world has changed. Imagine we're writing a story about a rural village in India somewhere and they need a medical clinic. At the beginning of the story, there is no clinic. At the end of the story, they've built a clinic. Change in circumstance. Something out there in the world has changed. Second one, change in insight. Something's changed in the mind of the main character. And the third one, change in relationship. Two people are strangers, two people are friends, two people are married, two people are separate, whatever it might be. So a story must have at least one of those. For a great one, usually operating with all three. So we'll take some questions now, but the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is the shape. This shape that I promised you before when I said our ancestors found a way to take information and put it together in a shape.
All right. I'm going to encourage everyone in the audience, in case if you have questions, please put them up in the Q&A box, and then we will move forward from there. So, Michael, before we have some questions from there as well, when we are talking about change in terms of, bringing in change while you're developing a story, how does one actually start from the storytelling concept? How do I get this ability in me to be able to tell stories? Because I think that's also very important. Rather than just being able to write it out, how do I actually express it as a story? How does someone start with this entire concept?
Well, there's two things to think about at the very beginning of the process. The first one is like, let's just say the workshop stopped here and I didn't even get into the rest of it for you. All you knew is that change was important. You said, I'm making a presentation at work, or I'm making a presentation to my colleagues, or I'm making a presentation to my students, or whatever it might be, and I want to include a story. Now, the first thing you're fighting against is this pop culture definition of story that we started off with, where a story is anything you say. Well, we know that's not true. So the first thing you should be thinking about is, what were the moments in my life where I changed the most? What were those turning points where everything changed for me overnight? Sometimes it's a positive thing, sometimes it's a sad thing, What are those like sliding doors moments where nothing after that was quite the same? Maybe it's a person that changed your life, maybe it's a job that changed your life, maybe it's a chance meeting, an accident, it could be anything, So when I'm working with people who want to be able to find the stories inside them, the first thing I tell them is, tell me the 5 moments in your life where everything changed for you, because that's where they live. That's where the stories live. And a lot of people don't realize that. They'll try to, I took a trip to Africa and it was really interesting. We call that in the story coaching world, like this stuff, we call it stuff that happened. Like, you went to Africa, you went on a trip, big deal. If you were changed by it, now I'm interested. But something that you did, I don't really care, So, and the same thing, your audience won't care either. But if you punctuate it by telling them that I thought I knew my neighbor and I always avoided her, but then one day I actually talked to her and that one conversation changed the course of my life. Suddenly they're on the edge of their seats, very interested in what you have to say and why you have to say it. So
agreed. I think that's also what makes thrillers really interesting for everyone, for that matter.
Yeah.
I have a question here from Indu, who says, how do you factor in emotions as a part of story? Is it the reason for recall as well?
Yes, of course. I mean, emotion is kind of like the flavor of the frosting, So what we're going to talk about when we get to the next piece in a second is the what's called the universal story structure. And the universal story structure is about the characters grappling with the problem of the story. And their struggle is all about not only their physical struggle sometimes, but also about their emotional struggle. So emotion is not like something that we use to sprinkle on or decorate the story. If you actually know what a story is, it's impossible to tell it without emotion, because that internal struggle is going to be the very heart of it.
Okay, I hope, Indu, that answers your question. We have one more short question here from Dina, who says, how do you start off a story for a kindergarten child? Because I think there what we're dealing with is it's a very different perspective altogether.
Well, so the genius of the universal story structure, these like steps that I'm going to tell you, is that the amazing part about it is you can literally take them up and slice them in any order that you want. Like, the order of the pieces is not very important. But we all know for little ones the format that they're used to, which is once upon a time, right? That's something called, I'm going to talk about this in a second, that's something called exposition. And exposition is when you tell them, like, here's what the normal world is like in our story. Kids like that because they know what's coming up next. For adults, though, stories very rarely tend to start with that kind of, here's what a normal day is like. They usually start with something flashy and exciting. And I'm going to get to all these terms of what we actually call these pieces in a second.
Okay, and I think one other thing that we'll do at the end of your lecture is also maybe you can let the audience know about your book, which is on Amazon, because I think Manutosh here is trying to find your books on Amazon, and maybe he can benefit from it, apart from others as well. Besali here also mentioned that, she lately feels that storytelling has become appropriated by sales and marketing departments of various big brands. How does that come into picture? But Besali, I think we'll take that question towards the end as well. And I'll let Michael move on with the session so that we can have some more coming in together as well.
No, I mean, that's a very good point. But the thing is that storytelling is for all of us, because storytelling is the most memorable form of communication. So just because marketers are using it doesn't mean it's exclusive to them. I mean, storytelling for fun is also the first form of entertainment, and that's why I run these live storytelling shows and things like that. So much fun. So let's go through this. Let's go through this package, basically.
Sure.
To tell a story, you basically need 4 elements, okay? Think about it like this. Imagine if I had a watch on and I take the watch off and I open up the back and we look at these gears. There's all these like different gears and all of them are important. In other words, if you take a screwdriver and you plucked out one of the gears, you would assume that the watch would not work and you would be correct. In other words, these elements that I'm about to describe to you are called the universal story structure elements, which means these gears must be present. They all have ramifications with the other gears. So that's the first thing that I want you to keep in mind. As I go through them, you're going to start to recognize them in the stories that you love. Why? Because all stories that you can possibly remember have these elements. Otherwise, you wouldn't remember them, because this is the shape that we talked about, this unforgettable shape. Okay, so the first one, the one we just talked about, this idea of once upon a time, this is called exposition. Okay, exposition means who, what, where, and when of the story. It's kind of like this. Imagine if we're building a house, but before we build the house, we have to build the foundation for the house to sit on. Exposition is that. Who is the character? When is the time period? Where is the location? And what refers to what does this character want the most? What's the point of this? The point of this is to establish the normal everyday world of the story. Remember, I'm not going to repeat this, but I want you to remember the punchline. The order of these pieces is not important. In fairy tales, we tend to get this right off the top. Once upon a time, there was a place, and in that place, there were these people, and every day they did this thing, right? But in stories for adults, sometimes these pieces are mixed up. That's the first one, exposition. The second one is called action, okay? And now this is the most challenging one to wrap your mind around, because action has all of these little subsections, but they're all really important. The first subsection of the action sequence is called the break in routine. And we knew this is coming because the whole point of putting once upon a time on page 1 of the fairy tale is because the first line on the second page is going to be, but then one day something unusual happened. You can use this same format in the stories that you tell. So every day I walk to work the same way. I take this road and I take that road, and every day same exact routine. But then one day I went to take that road and it was under construction, so I had to go a different route. And going that route, little did I know, would change everything for me, right? This is the beginning of any story. Routine, break in routine. Every day was like this, but one day was a little bit different. Break in routine. I hope that makes sense. Then we have something after that called the revelation. This break in routine is going to lead to the introduction of a problem. And this brings us to our second and our third definition of what a story is. A story is an attempt to solve a problem. If there's no problem, then there is no story. And the other thing, the third one here, is that a story is when something goes wrong. Sometimes people will submit a story to me and it's just about something, my 5 favorite places in Bombay or something like that. Not a story. Something must go wrong in order for something to be a story, okay? And this is where it first happens, in the revelation, the introduction of a problem. The third piece of the subsection of the action sequence is called the call. Who among us is going to rise up and try to fix this problem? So in your stories that you tell, exposition, break in routine, introduction of the problem, maybe you're the one that attempted to solve this problem. A lot of times, whoever gets selected to be the problem solver doesn't want to solve the problem because either they feel inadequate or they're in over their heads, or it's just intimidating. So that's why the fourth section of the action sequence is called the refusal of the call. And this is when the main character says, actually, this might be a little bit too difficult for me. But finally, through a whole variety of means, including peer pressure, social pressure, and personalization, the refusal is overcome, leading to what's called the quest. And the quest is embarking upon the story mission, the mission to solve the problem that was introduced at the revelation. The next piece is the longest piece of any story, which is the complications, all of the unforeseen obstacles that arise as you're trying to pursue that quest. The biggest obstacle that arises is the last one. That's called the catastrophe. And the catastrophe is the most challenging of all of the obstacles, so challenging that it's unlikely to be overcome at all. But when our main character, again, might be you, depending on your story, when our main character decides to push forward anyway and give it one final try, just even against the odds, that's called the critical choice. And the critical choice is the precursor right to the climax. And what is the climax? The climax is the collision of forces that are set into motion at the revelation. So in a story, we have these different types of conflict. We have person versus themselves, person versus nature, person versus person, all these types of things. When those two forces collide, they're actually kind of like two trains. Those trains are set into motion at that revelation that I talked about before, and then the quest and complications is happening, critical choice. When those two trains collide, we call that the climax. Climax is the easiest part to wrap your mind around. It's our third piece out of the four pieces of the universal story structure, with the action sequences being break in routine, revelation, call, refusal, quest, complications, catastrophe, critical choice. Next big piece, climax, collision of trains. And the fourth and final one is the resolution, which is the aftermath of the climax. And the resolution does a very important thing. It establishes the new normal world as a result of the major change at the climax. So suddenly, at this moment, the exposition becomes the old normal and the resolution becomes the new normal. Now, I've gone through very complicated material very, very quickly, but that's just to give you an introduction to what's called the universal story structure, the gears that make any story work the same way, that a watch needs all the pieces. All of those pieces are necessary because they have cascading ramifications on all of the other pieces. Sometimes the students I work with say, but I don't get it. All of those things have to be there. Not only do they have to be there, they are there. If you look closely at any story that you love, whether it's a movie, book, short story, anything else, you will see these pieces. And it's part of one of the great things about learning about story structures. You can actually not just appreciate what happens in the story, but you can appreciate how it's built also. And I think it makes it even more beautiful when you can see the behind the scenes architecture as well. Why is this important? Because and this is what I wrote about in my new book last year, once you know the universal story structure, you can build your story, right? You can outline your story, you can write your story, you can tell your story, whatever you want to do. But the amazing thing is what you can do next is that the situations in which we're able to tell our story in life change dramatically. Sometimes somebody gives us 20 minutes to tell a story. Sometimes we're going around a table and we have to try to tell our story in 2 minutes. Sometimes we have a chance to write our story down. Sometimes there's something called the elevator pitch, where you basically have to find a way to say a story in 30 seconds. Once you know the universal story structure and you understand how it's held up, you can build a doghouse, you can build a 2-story house, you can build a mansion. Because the fundamental structure of the building is the same, it's just changing in scale. So I hope that makes sense. Once we understand how it's built, we can build it as small or as big as we want. And in the book, I talk about the different permutations, the base, the maker, the vision, the morale builder, the springboard, the talk, the capsule, all these different types of stories, depending on the situation that you might be in. So some people were asking about where you can find it. My new one is at 8storiesbook.com. I think it takes you to the Amazon page or something like that. So story structure. Understanding story structure is the fundamental tool to understand the most memorable form of communication that our species has. There's a few other things that are worth talking about, and there's one more that I want to mention, because I know I promised you 2 more definitions, 5 total definitions of what a story is. One thing that makes a great story, and it's one of the things that we don't have enough time to talk about, is a story not only involves the mission to solve a problem out there, it also finally allows somebody to look inside them at the problems that are in here, our deepest fears, our deepest insecurities. It's kind of like the story buried within every story. There's 2 stories going on, that one and also this one, in the heart and also out there. And that's why another very useful definition, in fact, my favorite definition of a story is a set of circumstances that allows someone to finally confront her demons. So some stuff going on out there that finally gets me to look in here. I think that's a really important detail. And then the 5th and final one that I want to share with you today is a story is an invitation into somebody else's world. A story is an invitation into somebody else's world. So why is that useful? Because as writers and storytellers and communicators, part of what we want to do is get somebody to imagine what life is like in your shoes or somebody else's shoes, to get them to suspend their own everyday reality for a second, to say, maybe if I was in their shoes, maybe I would feel different, or I would react different, or maybe I would do something differently. Okay, so storytelling opens us up, and it makes us willing to explore the world of other people. And if we know how to do that, then it becomes so much easier to invite people into your own world as well. But you have to be able to use these signposts along the way in order to tell a story. If you don't do that, and you use the pop culture definition of story, you end up with something that I find interesting, but something that's sadly quite forgettable. If you use the story structure elements that I just mentioned, then no matter what shape and size and dimensions it might be, it's going to be memorable, and it might even change the listener's life. You never know. My life was changed by a story when I was 19 years old, and maybe yours was also, if you think about some of your favorites. So that's how powerful they are once you know how to build them. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Michael. That has been extremely specific, if I may say, and at the same time, very strong in terms of takeaways on how do you build your story. And I urge, I think, everyone in the audience as well, if you guys wish to sort of start writing in, even if it's a small story at your end, I think you can start off with these, the structure that we have in hand. I have quite a few questions with me from the audience, and I'm going to take them one by one. Sai Kiran wants to know, so we spoke about how a story needs to have a change, right? And you can't have them, let's say, I can't have a statement of facts or statement of what I've done earlier being put up as a story. Sai Kiran here has an interesting question who says that when someone is talking about their life, I did this, I did that, you know, I grew up here, I grew up there, isn't it an autobiography? And I would like to add up there, when we call it as an autobiography, there are at times where we've read autobiographies which may not necessarily have that format of change within them. How do they, you know, how do we go ahead in case if someone has to write something like an autobiography?
So if you're writing about yourself, that's perfectly fine. And obviously a lot of stories involve personal stories. And in fact, my company specializes in personal stories where people are talking about themselves. So yeah, you're right. It's autobiographical story. That's what it's called. Now, the stuff that happened, which is the stuff that I did in my life, it is important. So let's think about it like this, right? If I'm asking you, imagine a story is like a human body, okay? And the change is like the blood, right? And the universal story structure are like the organs and all that, those things that we add on. If it wasn't for the skeleton, we would just be a blob on the floor, right? what is the skeleton that serves as the basis for all of that stuff to be layered on top of it? It's the stuff that happened. I did this, I did this, I did this. But if we stop there, then we're just left with a skeleton. And we're not quite at the human body level yet. So sometimes when I'm in a short workshop like this, where I don't have a lot of time to talk about things, people will say, yeah, but isn't that stuff important? Like you're kind of immediately saying, hey, that stuff is so boring. That stuff is not interesting. No, that stuff is really important. That information is critical in order for us to get to knowledge and eventually to wisdom. But we can't stop there at information. And that's the problem with the pop culture definition of storytelling. My picture of poha in the morning on Instagram is just an image, it's just information. Without the next layers, there is no story. So that's a point that's really important to keep in mind. The stuff that happened, crucial. Now we need to put the skin on, now we need to put the muscle on.
I agree. I think we use the word story too loosely. In recent times. All right. I also have, so I think a lot of them have been trying to write down at least, the names of the 5 definitions that you said, and they'd like you to maybe repeat. So we mentioned about storytelling, we mentioned about exposition, we mentioned about action, and then Varnika wants to know what are the other 2 elements. So I think there are 2-3 people.
I didn't even know we were going to be talking about my new book, but just to kind of mention it for 10 seconds here. In the book, the 8 stories for organizations and professionals. I outlined them in crystal clarity. So it's a nice little 120-page book where you can see these pieces very, very clearly. It's important to keep in mind we have 4 big pieces, and then one of them, it has all these little slices to it. Okay, so we have exposition, which is that routine, once upon a time. And then we know that second piece is the first section of the action sequence, which is that break in routine. We establish the routine just so that we can shatter it. And then we have something after that called the revelation. And the revelation tells us that this break in routine is important, and it also gives us the first glimpse of the story problem. Like one day, I was working at a bank, we were making lots of money, everything was going fine. I was working in Manhattan. I mean, I'm just making this up, right? And we were working in Manhattan, everything's fine. All of a sudden, 2004 hit, financial crisis, complete disaster. Everybody's crying, people are leaving their jobs, right? Routine, break in routine. Problem, how am I going to get out of this alive? How am I going to not lose everything, right? So story problem, we get a little glimpse of it there. Next step is the call. Who's going to fix this problem? Can it be fixed? And then when somebody gets chosen, they say, hey, not me. This is too big of a problem for me. That's called the refusal of the call. Finally, either somebody is coerced, forced, or volunteers to fix the problem. That's called the quest. And then there's obstacles along the way. That's the complications. And then right when they're gaining some confidence and thinking, hey, this isn't so bad, we have the biggest of all obstacles, which is the catastrophe. Catastrophe makes the person realize there's no way to fix this problem. If we had more time, we could talk about the glimmer of hope that exists inside the catastrophe and the reason why it's there, which leads to giving it one final try, using your courage to give it one final try. That's called the critical choice. And that risk-taking critical choice leads to the climax, where basically it's the showdown between those 2 forces laid out in the revelation. We have the aftermath of the climax as the resolution at the end.
Okay, thank you for that. And I think everyone's sort of got the gist as well. I'm going to combine a couple of questions here. Vandana as well as Hina want to know that what happens in situations when you have clarity on the content. So you've written it down structure-wise, but you fall short of appropriate words and expressions to sort of, deliver your message. How do you use words that can actually depict the meaning of what you intend to sort of tell your audience as a story?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. There's basically two things to keep in mind, okay? The first one is you have to know who your audience is or the situation that the storytelling is taking place in. Let me give you an example. The way that we write is very different than the way that we speak. So if somebody were to ask me to write a personal story, let's say for an anthology or a collection of stories or something like that, I would write it in one way. if somebody asked me to tell a story at an event or something about, maybe there's an event about overcoming crisis in your life or something, okay, I'm going to tell a personal story. I'm going to make sure that when I talk, I use words that everybody understands. No technical terms, nothing like that, right? Just everyday normal words that everyone can relate to. Nobody will ever feel like stuck or confused on a particular word. And I tried to do that here today. I know I gave some technical terms, but that was because I was trying to outline the story structure. In writing, you can be a little bit more formal with your language. You can push things a little bit with particular words and using some vocabulary here and there and some subtlety. But when you're delivering something orally, you want to strip it down and make sure it's nice and simple. It does not have to have any kind of sophisticated vocabulary or anything like that. The second thing that you should keep in mind is this is the whole point of having somebody to read your work. So as a writing coach, what I do is every day I get sent material from my clients who say, hey, I'm giving a speech this weekend. Hey, I'm writing an article for the newspaper. I'm writing this journal piece. I'm writing this book. Can you clarify my voice so that it's as strong as possible? Great. We should all try to find somebody in our lives that can do that. And if you can't, sometimes you have to find a professional. But a lot of times it's very difficult for you to edit your own work and make it stronger. So you give it to somebody else and you say, Andrew, could you take a look at mine and see where I'm falling short language-wise? And they can play a role.
Okay, I hope that answers Vandana as well as Hina. Okay, I have another question here from Glennis Maria, who says, can a story be open-ended without any resolution? And I'm going to add Niket's question here, which says, then, if I have to keep it open-ended, does that sort of leave more of an impact on the listener to introspect? Specifically, when it is certain topics that require the story not to be complete, or they need the listener to sort of introspect. So how does that function? Or do we have to have a resolution at all times?
No, you don't have to have a resolution at all times. So there's something called a closed resolution and an open resolution. So closed means that we have a resolution just the way that I described it. The storyteller tells the listener the aftermath of the climax. An open resolution is exactly what you described. But there are certain challenges with open resolutions, okay? The biggest one is that a lot of times your readers or your listeners are really expecting the resolution. So when you deprive them of that, there better be a really good reason. And we talk about something called hyperrealism, a situation that they can absolutely very closely relate to. So people will have their opinions about what happened next. But there's another one in the professional world that is much more likely to cross your palate. And that's something in my book that I call the vision. So let me give you an example. Imagine if you're working in an organization and you want to tell a story about something like this. I believe that if we make this change at this company or organization, we can do all of these things, right? So you're kind of telling a story about either maybe a similar organization or about things you've noticed, like maybe you've even tried to make some of these changes in like small experiments and you've seen how much they work. And now what you're doing is you're proposing to everybody that we implement this on a company-wide scale, okay? Something like that. Well, when it comes time to for the resolution, there is no resolution because you're literally proposing that this thing happen right now. There is no future to talk about the aftermath of the climax. So that is a situation where you have to speculate about the resolution. What does that mean? It says, here's what we can do. We did it on a small case. Here's what happened. Now, if we did this as a group, we're going to face this obstacle and this obstacle and this obstacle. But once we finally put it together, here's what I believe we can accomplish. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what you're doing is you're providing the hypothetical resolution based on the evidence that you've noticed in these smaller experiments. So that's something that's actually in organizations, that's something that happens a lot. So technically the resolution is missing, but you're providing it because you're thinking ahead and predicting it.
Okay, all right. I also have another question which says, so is there a specific element of the structure that we've discussed that applies specifically to corporate storytelling? Because I think a lot of our audience as well that I see are people who are practicing or are willing to practice storytelling as a form of communication in their marketing or in their corporate lives. So is there any particular structure that's very famous, or if you've coached, anything that you see is recurrent?
Well, there is no such thing as corporate storytelling and non-corporate storytelling. It's just like whoever the story is pointed towards. You know, there's certain themes, I guess you could say, like, let's say, earning capacity or something like that versus personal catharsis, but the story structure is the same. It just happens to have a different theme. The one that's pretty consistent in the marketing work that I do, you know, I do consulting with companies and entrepreneurs and things like that. The one element that they're very interested in is, of course, the quest. Okay, what is the quest? The quest is the attempt to solve a problem. So think about a product, for example, right? A product is basically, here is our proposal for how to solve this problem. The current problem-solving products on the market are not affordable or are not very effective. So we're going to create this product because we think that it's going to be able to solve problems better than the other guy. Or we have a business model that we think is better than the competitors. So the quest is basically, here's how it works, here's how it solves the problem. That's critical to any business plan, because that's the whole point of the plan, is that this is how we're going to make our money, by solving this problem.
Okay. All right. I have a question from Tanvi and another audience, another member as well. How do you recognize that you have written a good story? Are there any markers or indicators that the author can use for themselves? And also, I think, how can you map feedback? Like, I've written a story. I think it's really nice. I've done my checks. If, you know, from Tanvi's question, I've done these particular checks and I understand that the story is nice, but how do I really gauge or understand feedback?
Well, I'll leave that second one. I'll leave that second one to the side, because there's so many different permutations about how to gauge feedback, and also when to not listen to feedback. You know, sometimes it's like great story is just a bad situation, you know, and you can end up coming to the wrong conclusion about what your story is like. But the more interesting one to me is, how do you know that you have a great story? And there are a few indicators, and I wish we had more time that we can talk, but I'll give you one. And there's probably 10 that we could go through. But one of them is something called vulnerability. One of the ways that you can get a group of people to dislike you instantly is to go up in front of everyone and tell them how amazing you are and how clever you are. I mean, it works so fast. The easiest way to be disliked. You want people to like you? Go up there and tell them how inadequate you feel sometimes and how difficult you find problems to solve. But if you also tell them that you're diligent and committed and you're willing to persevere, even though sometimes you feel inadequate, they're going to be on your side. They're going to be right by you the whole time. And they're really going to admire you for admitting that in front of a group of people. Because, you know, in the reality is, there's no such thing as failure. There's just learning, right? So when you go up and you're courageous enough to admit that you failed in the past, but you've pushed forward anyway, this is one of the hallmarks of a great story. Something embarrassing, something where you were inadequate, but something where you came out the other end a little bit stronger.
Agreed. I think even when we are doing outreach and marketing as well, it's so much more important that you're connecting with your audience. If you're not able to connect, and if that personal experience is not there, so the moment I talk about my school days or my college days to a student who is now looking forward to university life, I think it makes so much more sense.
And if you're honest to them, you know, if you do you've seen these presentations that are the person is so slick that you know it's just a pitch, and then you know that there's no reality behind it. But if you honestly talk to people and are willing to say, hey, you know, we're not perfect, but we're getting there, they're so much more willing to listen to what you have to say, I think.
True. I'm going to take maybe one or two last questions from Vedla Srinivas, who wants to know that storytelling can be using colorful images, powerful words, moving images, etc. Which model do you think is more effective? Is there a certain way of storytelling that is much more effective than the others?
Well, these days, I mean, it's not
I think you mean a tool, whether you're wanting to communicate through a picture or a word or likewise.
Well, one of the first things you'll ever learn if you take a writing class or a writing workshop or a story workshop is something called show, don't tell. Mm-hmm. And what show, don't tell means is let your listeners or your readers, whatever, let them see what you saw. but you don't always have to point out to them exactly, you don't have to evaluate exactly what you saw. Let me give you an example. Imagine you're telling a story about you went to South Africa on a safari and you thought you were alone, and all of a sudden you turned around and you saw 3 lions standing there, right? You don't have to then spend the next 8 sentences telling them how scared you were, right? They know how scared you are. All you have to say is that I never felt my stomach go up into my throat before, right? That's all you have to say. And they know exactly that now you're scared for your life. So showing means just presenting things, almost like telling the story like it's a movie, instead of kind of like talking down to the reader and telling them exactly how you felt and evaluating, this was scary, I was nervous. Let them see you and then draw their own conclusion. That's one of the things that we love about reading, is that it's like the author is starting the story, but we're kind of finishing it in our minds, you know?
Okay, and I don't know whether it's going to take a little bit while, but Priya Veeraraghavan wants to know, how do you explain an anticlimax? And I'm taking this because I'm also interested in the same thing. But how do you explain an anticlimax? We spoke about climax, and there are a lot of now talks about, you know, how writers are weaving in an anticlimax into their stories. How do we explain that?
Well, the phenomenon of this is this idea that sometimes there's what's called a fake climax in a story, where those two, that high moment of tension is on the horizon. And we see this a lot in like really bad like action movies and stuff like this, where basically we have that collision of forces, only to find out a few minutes later that that's not the real collision of forces, right? They're like, we're kind of faked out and thinking like, imagine that there's the 2 armies that are colliding or something like that. But little did we know that there's a 3rd army also coming, right? But when those 2 collide, we think that the story has reached its climax, only to find out that the true climax is coming later. So this idea of an anti-climax and this tricking the audience into thinking what moment of the story is most important. Now, it's kind of gimmicky, but it's also quite useful, because one of the things that we love in storytelling is when unexpected things happen. We really want unexpected stuff to happen. So we don't even mind being tricked every once in a while, as long as something is coming at us that we couldn't predict, you know.
All right, I think we do have quite a few others as well, but that'll take us a whole another hour to complete the questions. And in the interest of time, thank you so much, Michael. It's been a wonderful session. I think a lot of clarity with where we can put through things. And I personally believe that, you know, you don't need to use this structure only while writing a story or doing something. You can put the structure overall, even in the way that you converse on a regular basis. And that makes it much more effective in terms of you know, as a communicator as well. Yeah. So again, once again, thank you so much for your time on a Saturday evening. Guys, I've already put up the link where you can access Michael's books. That is the 8storiesbook.com. I'm again typing it into the chat box, so you have a direct link to it. And you should be able to find his book on Amazon and take in a worthwhile conversation ahead. Thank you once again. And I'm just going to be letting you in on the next session that we have planned for 25th September. We're going to be meeting after 2 weeks for our next session, which is on Diamonds in the Dust with Saurav Mukherjee and Professor Sanjay Bakshi. From storytelling to finance, we move to a whole different world altogether for this interesting conversation. Mind you, this is not an evening session. It's a morning session, 11 to 12. So be sure that you're available there. The registration links, everything will be there up on the Flame website and on the social media handles. The recording of today's session will be uploaded on the Flame University YouTube channel. So in case if you wish to have a recon of it, if you want to just go back and take some more notes from what Michael has told us across the last 1 hour, most welcome to do the same. Thank you so much. And I look forward to meeting you all on the 25th of September as well. Thank you.